Please welcome Craig Elias from Shift Selling. He's the Chief Catalyst. What a fun title, and that's absolutely true. He makes things happen. Here we go.
Thanks, Ken, very much. I'm just going to pull this a little. Oh, is this attached to the clock? No, just tight. Okay, so the reason I'm here is I'm here to share with you basically the one thing I've learned makes the biggest difference in sales. When you magically show up in front of the right people at exactly the right time, sales is easy. And I've seen stats that say your close ratio, if you are second in on a deal, someone who's thinking of changing, the odds you win are about 17%. That data comes from 2009 and in 1979. So that data basically hasn't changed in almost 40 years. The other research says that if you're the first one in at the right time, the average close ratio is 74%. That's by Forrester. They announced that last year in a webinar I did with them. My research 10 years ago had 75%. So again, basically the data hasn't changed in almost 10 years. So as Ken says, my name's Craig Elias. And for about 20 years, I was just this lucky sales guy. I had this knack of just showing up at the right place at the right time. And every company I worked for, it just happened. But I had no idea why. It just happened. And then one day it stopped. And one of the reasons it stopped is I went to work for a company called WorldCom. $11 billion in accounting fraud. I joined them the day before 9/11. Okay, then 9/11 happens, but as always happened in my life, in less than 6 months, I'm the #1 sales guy in the entire country. And I went from hero to zero basically in 21 days when they admitted to conducting all this accounting fraud. So what I did for the first time in my life, I did something that my sales managers never taught me. My sales managers had always taught me that if I lose a deal, I should never lose the lesson, and I should analyze the deals I lose, so I try to figure out how can I win. There's a really cool guy down in the valley. His name is Guy Kawasaki. One of the things that Guy says that drives me crazy sometimes, he says, hope is not a strategy. When you analyze the deals you lose, hoping you can figure out how to win, that is not a strategy. So what I did for the first time in 20 years, I looked back on all the 6, 7, and 8-figure deals that I could remember winning, and I figured basically 3 things out. I have since written a book about this. Some cool people have had great things to say about the book. If you're here, hand me a card or text me, and I will get you a free copy of the book. If you're online, send me a LinkedIn connection request, and I will send you back the link to get the entire book for free. The first 3 chapters is basically what did I figure out in the summer of 2002. And then the back 4 chapters is basically what was I doing for 20 years just to be lucky everywhere I went. So here's one of the first things I figured out in that summer of reflection. When you're prospecting, trying to get a new customer, that prospect is always in one of 3 different buying modes. First one's called status quo, also known as path dependency. They've done the same thing the same way for so long, it's just simply keep doing the same old thing. Right? And the average close ratio of someone's happy and not looking to change, pretty close to 0. I don't care what the Challenger sale says, and I will go on record saying this. You can try and disturb the status quo, it doesn't work, and I'll share with you some other people that believe it, and I'll share with you some stats on how you can change it and actually make it work. So sometimes you talk to people that are happy and not looking, status quo. Sometimes you'll find people that come to you, fill in a form, they're actively engaged in the process of searching for alternatives. What I do agree with the Challenger sale is that by the time they come to you, they've already made 57% of the decision or more. So there it's too late. This is where you get on average a close ratio of about 17%. The first thing I figured out in the summer 2002 is between these 2 commonly known buying modes, happy, not looking, unhappy, and I am looking, is unhappy but too busy to do anything about it yet. And when you get to these people, every single big deal I could remember happened here. My average close ratio here, when I reflected, was 8 out of 10. Forrester says for the industry, it's about 74%. Okay? Now, here's the thing. You get to someone who's in this window of dissatisfaction, you are on average 5 times more likely to win the deal. Not only do you win the deal, but you get the best customers. You probably have a few of these, right? They're loyal, profitable, and they give us what we all want, testimonials, referrals, generate word of mouth. These are the kind of customers we want to get more of. So some people say, challenge the customer. I totally disagree. I've seen some stats, and I've talked to some very senior people inside some very large technology firms. They try the Challenger sale. The biggest problem they have is not getting first meetings. The problem is they get a second meeting only 7% of the time, right? And even Salesforce says, don't bother trying to do this because it's really not worth the effort. So if that's the case, what can you do? For me, what you can do is you can figure out what is it that takes somebody who was one day happy and not looking and makes them now thinking of changing. There's things called triggers. Or in my world, it's called a trigger event. So you got to look for the things that happen. So in my world, there's really 3 different triggers. One event happens, makes somebody want to change. Just because somebody wants to change doesn't mean they will, because they generally can't afford to change. They either don't have the time to look at what you have or spend time with your salespeople, or they don't currently have the money yet to buy it. And even when they have those 2 things, it's very often not until they have the 3rd event where they can justify the purchase to somebody else that they actually become a customer. So these are the 3 events that people have to go through, whether it's B2C or B2B. It's almost exactly the same. So I figured this out in 2002, and I was kind of the crazy kid on stage for about 7 years, and then McKinsey joined the fray, and they did a lot of research, found almost the exact same thing, that people are in this loyalty loop, and they stay there until something triggers their interests, and then someone creates what's called an initial consideration set. If you are not in this initial consideration set, you won't even know that there's an opportunity. The difference between the way I think and what McKinsey says is McKinsey doesn't talk about this afford trigger. Why does someone all of a sudden now have more time to look or more money to buy? And when you can figure this out, you're much more likely to get them as a customer. But you can't wait until here. Because if you're not on the initial consideration set, you're never going to even understand there was an opportunity. So that was in 2009. In 2011, Google figured this out. They have something called the Zero Moment of Truth for all the marketers that are listening or those in the room. It's called Zero Moment of Truth. Jim Lisinski from Google wrote a really great book. It's all about how do you find a way to get found more on the internet. People are thinking of changing. How do you get found? And this Zero Moment of Truth, which is my window of dissatisfaction, they say it's created by stimulus. I call that an event. Something all of a sudden turns on that Zero Moment of Truth. And some of Google's biggest customers have figured this out. You can use this in B2C and in B2B. And then the research proves that even to be true in the B2B space, Andrew Gaffney figured out in 2013, 80% of corporate purchases are unbudgeted and unplanned. Something happens, and all of a sudden budget that was assigned for one thing gets ripped out of there and assigned to something else. I love trade shows. Budget gets moved around for trade shows, right? This is a great opportunity. If you sell anything relevant to trade shows, follow up, this is a great opportunity to go get more customers. One of the guys who shares my content with his customers has some really great stats around messaging relevant to trigger events or trying to get to people when they've had an event versus just generic messaging, cold calling. And what his customers see on average is they get first meetings 530% more often when they focus on those that have just had an event. That for me is a big number. But for me, I come back to this whole thing about the challenger sale and the problem that people have. I get a first meeting, but I don't get a second meeting because the second meeting ratio is about 7%. Well, it turns out, and when he does the stats, that your second meeting ratio goes up 330%. So you are, on average, about 17.5 times more likely to get someone to this stage just because you focus on events. Now, one of my favorite events is when somebody has a bad experience. Someone has a bad experience with a product or a person. They get really frustrated. They leave. Sales cycles are really short when someone has a bad experience. It's not so much they want to become your customer. They just don't want to be somebody else's. Right? The next one is changes. So bad experience is what happens with the current vendor. Changes are what happen inside the organization. And the 2 big changes for me are changes in people and changes in places. So watching for a change in an executive, a decision maker, and watch when they change locations. So a lighting company that I have as a customer had a big retail chain that they were trying to get into. and they couldn't get in. They had this really, money-saving energy, lighting, but they couldn't get into this large retail chain. And all of a sudden, this retail chain decided they wanted to open a location in a town called Guelph in Ontario. And Guelph has legislation that says for lighting in the retail space, you're allowed no more than 2 watts of lighting per square foot. And their old solution didn't work. So it was a change in location, new legislations in that location, whether it's different state, different province, different country. And they called these guys in. They put the new LED lighting in one store. There was all the energy savings, which were natural. But then they went back to that retail location about 6 months later, and what they realized is that that store generated 22% more revenue per square foot than using the old lighting. And every other store in that retail chain installed that technology. But it wasn't until the change in places and all of a sudden they had to change that then allowed them to get in to that account. One of the stats I love to use, this is a company called Discover.org. They have done research on IT decision makers. And when an IT decision maker is new in a role, either move up an organization or join an organization, there's a percentage of them that will spend $1 million or more in new initiatives the first year in their job. So $1 million in the first year. 80% of those people spend that $1 million in the first 90 days. If you miss the first 90 days, you've missed an opportunity. So I have shared this whole idea of executive changes as an opportunity to go get a customer. And people says, oh, there's one executive change, there's one opportunity. Well, that's not actually the case. It turns out that one executive change creates multiple opportunities. And I like to use the Beatles as an example. Okay, so let's say you've got a customer, right, and your best contact is named Ringo. He gets a new job. The first question you need to figure out is, where did he go? Because if he used you in the past, likely to use you again. The second opportunity is George, because George used to have Ringo's job. He's moved into a new role. He's now got more money, more authority, more influence. He's likely to try and make things happen in the next 90 days. Opportunity number 3, who took Ringo's place? John took Ringo's place. You go talk to John, and there's really only one question you need to ask John. First question you need to ask John is, where did you come from? Because he's left a vacancy where that person will soon make change happen. Now, I've shared this strategy. If you have someone on a marketing list and the email address bounces, most organizations take them off the list. I'm like, don't take it off the list. Give it to your best rep. Because all of a sudden, there's all these opportunities. So I've shared this strategy for a while. People have said to me for quite a while, Craig, I like the strategy, but the problem I have with this strategy is it doesn't scale. So one day I had a meeting, someone canceled, and it was about the time that someone said to me, this idea doesn't scale, and it's one of my pet peeves. So I brought out one of my favorite sales tools called Excel, and I ran the numbers. And basically, if you have 100 people that you follow, just 100 decision makers, and if you follow all the bounces and all the opportunities that come then behind it, in just a year, right, you would have 39 opportunities a month. This again, starting with 100. If you do it for 2 years, 75. And people go, that's not that big. But when you add all those numbers up, look what happens. 270 opportunities by just following a list of 100 and all the job changes. Now, this is based upon U.S. Census data that says on average about 3% of the population changes jobs every single month. So there's a huge opportunity here. Imagine if that number was not 100, but 1,000 or 10,000. Now this scales. Now, earlier you had Kyle up here from SalesLoft. One of the things that makes this easier to do is when you use SalesLoft, you can get the email address of someone who's brand new in the job, even though a list provider doesn't have it. I have used it to get meetings with CEOs, CMOs, and VPs of sales in their first week in their job. And I have a message very specific to what they want to get done, and I get meetings almost 100% of the time. So John Lubbock once said, what we see depends upon what we look for. So this, for me, is why I think it's important to analyze the business you win, not the business that you lose. There is a guy named Julian Gordon. I saw a great quote from him a little while ago, and his quote goes like this. He says, how far will the right answers to the wrong questions get you? And my argument to you is if you're doing a lost sales analysis, you are asking the wrong questions. When you get someone who becomes a customer, there's only 4 questions you need to ask them. First question, what event or what events led up to this purchase? When you ask this question after you've done the deal, they'll tell you about the second event where they could afford to buy. But that's not the most powerful one. You want to figure out what was the first event. So I've learned I have to ask a second question. And that second question is, when did these events happen? And when I ask that second question, I learn of the first event. The third question is, what made you choose us? I don't ask why questions. I have been told that why questions make people defensive. And when someone says, when you ask the question, what made you choose us, what you're listening for is verbs, not nouns. You're listening for the outcome of being your customer. One of my favorite stories is a company that sells very expensive tires. So let's pretend you sell very expensive tires. You want to get on the radar screen of someone. Someone's new in a job. What are you going to tell them? Oh, we'll save you money because you replace them less often. You'll get better fuel efficiency. But it turns out, when this question was asked once, the customer said back to the vendor that we became the preferred vendor in a highly competitive marketplace. And you ask yourself, how does buying expensive tires make you the preferred vendor in a highly competitive marketplace? Well, it turns out we have the highest on-time delivery statistics, and being the highest on-time delivery means we get all the rush stuff that they pay way more for than all the stuff they give to all the bottom feeders. So understand the real value of being your customer. What made you choose us? Question number 4, I'm a big fan of a guy named Kurt Lewin. He's done research on what's called force field analysis. The way I think about that is what prevents people from becoming your customers. So question number 4 for me is, what can we do to make it easier to become our customer? So if you're online, send me a LinkedIn connection request. If you're here, text me. I will send you the link. Or if you want to give me a card, I will send you an entire copy of the book. And on that, who has questions?
I have a question for you, Craig. We're asking this of all of our thought leaders. Why do you love Salesforce.com?
Good question. So one of the things I love about Salesforce is that it allows my customers to track the difference between the day that I start and when I finish. And they see these incremental changes in what they do, and all of a sudden they see the value of implementing something like this, and it becomes really easy for them to recommend me to somebody else. So I love the fact that Salesforce makes it really easy for customers to track the metrics that are relevant to this and makes them more likely to tell other people about this. I'm a big fan of some work done by a guy named Jonah Berger. Jonah Berger wrote a book called Contagious, and it's all about the power of word of mouth and how do you find a way to create more word of mouth. So in this webinar that we did a little while ago, what I offered up was I offered up my slides in a native PowerPoint format. We had almost 3,000 people that registered for that event. I had 500 people fill in the form just because they wanted my slides. They get my slides, what do? They share them with their team. I have one guy, and I use tools like email opens, tracking email opens. I have one guy in Ireland, not the guy who has the stats, totally different guy, who asked for this. I emailed it to him, and I noticed that in the last year, that email has been opened over 10,000 times. One single email offering up something that they wanted, and it's been forwarded and forwarded and forwarded and opened over 10,000 times.
That's incredible. Do we have any other questions from anybody? So if you remember, go out here and send him an email. Is that right?
So you can text me or
send
me a LinkedIn connection request.
Guys, this is one of the coolest books you'll ever find on how to build yourself a book of business when people change positions. It's an amazing strategy It happens all the time when everybody else in the industry thinks if your decision maker leaves, you're out of luck. Craig says, no, I'm going to turn that lemon into lemonade and make some good things happen. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Let's give him another big hand, could we?